I mean, Jesus says, in this world you will have trouble. And he doesn't follow it up by saying, but take heart. If you ever find it, I'll fix it for you real quick. Remember the famous Psalm, Psalm 23, the Lord is my shepherd, I have everything I need. It doesn't say the Lord is my shepherd, and because he is, I won't ever walk through the valley of the shadow of death, but if I do, he'll pop me out of it real fast. What's the promise? Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. Why? Not because it always goes away. Because the Lord is with me there. It's not a what. The promise is a who. Hey, if you got a Bible, grab it and meet me in Luke chapter 4 today. Luke chapter 4, as you just heard, the final installment of a teaching series we've been in for the last 4 weeks called Wrapped, where we're looking at some of the gifts that Jesus brought when he arrived the very first time that some of us feel like perhaps we're still waiting to receive. Maybe like the gift that stays unopened under the tree until this Christmas. Growing up, my dad earned a reputation as something of a Christmas gift clairvoyant. You have anybody like that in your life? It doesn't matter what you get them, they know what it is before they unwrap it. Okay, this is my dad. We would be sitting together around the Christmas tree, getting ready to open presents, and the gifts would all get handed around or placed under the tree, and when it came to be his turn, he would say, yeah, I think I'll open the shop vac next. It's like, come on, like, why do we even wrap it? And maybe that's an easy example. You know, those boxes are giant. How many things could it be? But he would do it on the smaller things too. Like he would say, yeah, I think I'll do the socks now. And we'd go over and grab a box and hand him a box. And he would go, no, that's the electric screwdriver. The socks are over there. I want the socks now. I'll do the screwdriver next. And I know what you're thinking, because we thought the same thing. Like, we accused him of all kinds of shenanigans, but he didn't buy his own gifts. He didn't wrap his own gifts. My mom would take steps to make sure he could not peek at his gifts to know what they were before he saw them. Like, in fact, one time, I just so distinctly remember, she had hidden a gift in a place that he never ever would have found it, never could have known to even look for it, and she brought it out that morning. There was no chance for him to peek at it. She put it under the tree. Comes time to it, she says, I bet you can't guess what this one is. And she carries it over to him, puts it in his lap, and he goes, I bet it's a socket set with a sweater wrapped around it. Like, you could have convinced us as kids that he had X-ray vision, but he didn't. And in fact, it wasn't until just a few years ago I actually figured out what it is. See, the thing with my dad is almost impossible to buy for, and he knows it. And so he also knows that when Christmas begins to approach, that if he just drops little hints, they go a long way. So we'd have these moments where, he would be sitting there in the living room in the evening, and he'd say around Christmas time, gosh, I really have been wanting a new socket set. Or he'd walk through the store with my mom, and he'd look at a sweater and say, well, that is a really nice sweater. And he'd kind of hold it up and look at it, then put it back on the rack and walk away. And he knew that for people like us, that was like throwing raw meat to a pack of hungry lions. Somebody was buying that socket set before the end of the day, or buying that sweater before we even left the store. And then he just kept track of the hints that he'd given. And he knew what would be right there under the tree. And when all of the gifts were open and the only thing left is a socket set and a sweater, he knew exactly what was under the tree. The only way to fool my dad was to get him something that he didn't know he needed, or that he hadn't known to expect. But when you buy something for someone that's hard to buy for, something that they don't know that they need or don't know to expect, it's sort of a risky proposition, isn't it? I don't know if you thought about it. That's really the Christmas story, isn't it? In some ways, what we've said for the last 4 weeks, when Jesus stepped onto the scene, everyone had their list of what they expected, what they believed they needed, what the one who had been promised for thousands of years would bring when he arrived on the scene. They wanted someone who would bring an economic solution to their situation. They were taxed to oblivion. They were occupied by the Romans. They wanted somebody to set them free from that. They wanted a political revolution who would give them their power back in their country. They were captives, oppressed in their own land, and they wanted to go free. And then one day in Nazareth, the baby that Mary had wrapped in swaddling clothes, laid in a manger, now all grown up, steps onto the scene, begins to speak. He gets the scroll of the book of Isaiah, and he looks through it until his eyes landed on Isaiah 61, and there in the middle of the synagogue, in front of all of the people, he begins to unwrap who he is, and this is what he reads. We have it recorded in Luke chapter 4, beginning in verse 18. "The Spirit of the Lord is on me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." And then he rolled up the scroll and he handed it back to the attendant, and he sat down and he told everyone in the crowd who was listening, "Today, this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing." And everyone in that synagogue that morning said, "Oh, I know what this is. Yeah, I'll unwrap that next." Luke tells us they were amazed. And then that 6 verses later, they tried to throw him off a cliff. God with us was there with them. God in flesh had shown up on the scene, and the people there on the scene couldn't see who he is. Because he wasn't what they thought they needed. He wasn't what they'd come to expect. They thought they needed a system. They thought they needed a philosophy, a set of practical steps, maybe even a new religion with some rituals, some rules, restrictions they could hold themselves to and everybody else to as well. When their rescue didn't take the form that they expected, their restoration didn't happen the way that they dreamed, they rejected the gift altogether. Good news, freedom, favor with God, and life that's truly life. The one who could give sight to the blind showed up right in front of them, and they couldn't or wouldn't see him. And Luke doesn't want that to happen to you this Christmas. We've said throughout the series, these verses in Luke 4 are the thesis statement for Luke's gospel. It's why he chooses the stories that he chooses to tell throughout the rest of his gospel. And in Luke's gospel, you see people all over the gospel that can't see, and can't see for different reasons. But he really draws it out in 2 places, and I want to look at one of them today because I think it's one that might surprise you and might encourage you this Christmas. Then I'll point you to the other ones because I think it ties the whole story and series together. If you still got your Bible open to Luke 4, flip over a couple of pages to Luke chapter 7. Luke chapter 7. Luke points to at least 4 different reasons that a person might be blind. 4 different kinds of blindness in his gospel. 4 different reasons that a person might not be able to see who Jesus is. One of them's physical blindness. That's an obvious one. We'll actually see a person that struggles with that at the very end of the message today. But another is spiritual blindness. Maybe you're familiar with this. This is something that the Pharisees struggled with. They wouldn't or couldn't see Jesus, even though he was right there in front of their face because of the hardness of their hearts. But here in Luke chapter 7, we see a story that includes two reasons people were struggling to see Jesus who desperately wanted to see him more than anything else. One of them's a blindness because of circumstances. And one of them's a blindness because of expectations. So look at the story. It involves a guy who's actually a part of the Christmas story. John, we know him as John the Baptist, even though he was clearly more charismatic than any of the Baptists that I know would be comfortable with. So you might call him John the Baptizer. That's John. He's actually the first one other than Mary and Joseph to hear and respond to the news about who Jesus is. He paved the way for Jesus. He proclaimed the story of Jesus, the news about Jesus. He baptized Jesus in the Jordan River. But now he's been thrown in a prison and left there to rot by a narcissistic king named Herod, who couldn't understand why John told Herod that Herod shouldn't marry his brother's wife while his brother was still married to her and while he was still alive. John's sitting in prison. Jesus is proclaiming good news to the poor and setting captives free. Look what it says in Luke chapter 7, beginning in verse 16. They, that's the people who have seen and heard Jesus do all this stuff around them, were all filled with awe and praising God. A great prophet has appeared among us, they said. God has come to help his people. And the news about Jesus spread throughout Judea and the surrounding country. Keep reading. Word gets back to John, who understandably has a few questions from prison about how God has come to help his people. Verse 18, John's disciples told him about all these things. Calling two of them, he sent them to the Lord to ask, "Are you the one who's to come? Or should we expect somebody else?" I wonder this morning if you can relate to John. On one hand, you rejoice. God's shown up for his people. Emmanuel, God with us. It's good news. You may even have memories of him showing up for you. But it's been a while. Sure be simpler to see him if you could see him show up for you here, wherever here looks like for you today. Think about John. John knew Jesus was the one theoretically. John knew Jesus was the one theologically. He preached that message. He knew Jesus is the one philosophically, intellectually, religiously, academically, anecdotally. All of the arguments make sense to John. All of the evidence checks out for John, except the evidence personally. Where John is sitting, from what John sees, it's awfully hard to see Jesus personally and practically. He's blind where he is, isn't he? He's desperate to see Jesus, but he's struggling to see Jesus in his circumstances. And we'll look how Jesus responds to the question because it's surprising on a couple of levels. But first, I think it's important to notice a couple of things about John's question. First, notice what John doesn't ask from this moment because it reveals something about his heart that I think is really important. Notice that he doesn't ask. He doesn't ask, "Jesus, are you going to make this better for me or should I look for someone else?" That's not his question. "Jesus, are you going to fix my circumstance or should we look for someone else?" That's the question I would have asked, especially if I was John, right? That's the question I have asked when I've been in moments like John. I mean, you can imagine what John's thinking if you've ever been in a place like that. Like, Jesus, all I've done is be faithful to you. I've given up everything for you. I paved the way for you. I told my friends about you. Jesus, I told my enemies about you. All I've ever done is everything you asked. And frankly, all you've done, Jesus, is everything for everybody else. The lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, the dead are raised, the poor have good news. You freed other captives. Jesus, when is it going to be my turn? That's not John's question. And it reveals something powerful about John. John doesn't need to see the what in order to be satisfied, as long as he's able to see the who clearly. He's saying, Jesus, if I can see who you are, I can endure this. If the one who controls everything is present with me and personal to me, I can trust there's a plan in this, even if I don't see it. If I know it's him, the presence of the one can overwhelm the what. And think for a second just about your own experience, maybe at less existential levels than this. Isn't this true for us? Remember when you were a child and you had a nightmare? Remember when you fell and scraped your knee? Or you wrestled with a bully on the playground? What you instinctively cry out for? Not a what? Not a system. Not a strategy. Not even necessarily a fix. You wanted a who. And the presence of the who with you could let you rest, despite the what. Maybe that's true on a cosmic scale too. John seems to believe that it is. But what do you expect Jesus to say anyway when he hears the question John's asking? If you're reading there for the first time, you know anything about Jesus, don't you expect him to say, well, since you asked, John, yes, I am the one. Thanks for your patience. But here's how you know. At the moment these messengers get back and proclaim to you the news of who I am, the walls are going to shake and the bars are going to fall down and all of the wardens are going to fall asleep and you're going to walk out of prison free as you've ever been before. That's what you expect Jesus to do, isn't it? Does it for other people in similar circumstances all throughout the story? Surely that's what he'll do for John, of all people. We'll look at verse 22. So he replied to the messengers, go back and report to John what you have seen and heard. The blind receive sight. The lame walk. Those who have leprosy are cleansed. The deaf hear, the dead are raised. The good news is proclaimed to the poor. That sure sounds an awful lot like Luke 4, doesn't it? Sounds an awful lot like Isaiah 61, doesn't it? The promise of God of the one who was to come. Luke's drawn our attention back there. Look at what Jesus says, verse 23. Blessed is anyone who doesn't stumble on account of me. And that word stumble is a lot bigger word than just a word that means to miss your step and temporarily lose your balance, the way we use the word stumble. It's a Greek word scandalizo. We get our word scandal from it, and it literally means to fall completely on your face, to yard sail it straight into a pit or straight off a cliff because you can't see or won't see or aren't watching where you're going. Jesus said, blessed is anyone who doesn't fall on their face, notice, because of me. Blessed is the one who continues to trust even when they can't see me or don't see me in the way they expected to see me show up. When, like in John's case, you hear that Jesus is showing up for everybody else and he's not showing up for you yet, or he's not showing up for you anymore. The Bible's awfully realistic about this, isn't it? I mean, preachers aren't always realistic about this. Christians, aren't always realistic about this. The Bible is awfully honest about this. I mean, Jesus says, in this world you will have trouble. And he doesn't follow it up by saying, but take heart. If you ever find it, I'll fix it for you real quick. Remember the famous Psalm, Psalm 23, the Lord is my shepherd, I have everything I need. Doesn't say the Lord is my shepherd, and because he is, I won't ever walk through the valley of the shadow of death, but if I do, he'll pop me out of it real fast. What's the promise? Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. Why? Not because it always goes away. Because the Lord is with me there. It's not a what. The promise is a who. A who that doesn't always show up, when, or how, or in the way that we expect. Notice he doesn't with John. John stays in the circumstance. John dies in the circumstance, but he doesn't die blind in the dark, even though it's dark where he lives. Remember, that's what Jesus told the people back in Nazareth. So what made them want to throw him off a cliff? Jesus said, I'm here to give you life, and life abundantly. And they said, cool, we know exactly what that looks like. And he says, well, hang on just a second. I'm here to give you life abundantly. I'm not here to fix all your circumstances immediately. And that wasn't enough for them. They tried to run him off a cliff because he wasn't what they expected and didn't bring what they wanted right now. So they determined that he wasn't what they needed at all. Their expectations kept them from seeing him. They were blind because of their expectation. John was blind because of a situation. And maybe this morning you or someone you love is too. Notice, John's blindness is not a problem with Jesus. And notice, John's blindness is not a problem with John. Sometimes we think that, don't we, when we find ourselves in this circumstance? I must have done something. I must have done something wrong. God must be angry at me. That's why I find myself here. Luke wants you to know this is not a problem with John for your sake. And Jesus wants you to know it and wants the crowd to see it for John's sake too. Look what he says, because after sending these people back with sight for John about who he is, he offers it to the crowd, and he offers it to the rest of us as well. Look at verse 24. After John's messengers left, Jesus began to speak to the crowd about John. What did you go out into the wilderness to see? A reed swayed by the wind? If not, what did you go out to see? A man dressed in fine clothes? No, those who wear expensive clothes and indulge in luxury and palaces. What did you go out to see? A prophet. Yes. And I tell you, and more than a prophet. This is the one about whom it's written, I will send my messenger ahead of you who will prepare your way before you. He says, what were you coming out here expecting? You came out here because you wanted to see someone who could see someone that you couldn't see and who could show him to you when he comes so that you could see him too. That's what John's done. So the question remains, can you see who John has shown, even when the one John's shown doesn't show up the way you expected him to show up? Jesus wants to make sure that they know this is not a problem with John. John's still doing his job, despite his doubts, despite his questions, despite his encounter with what the ancients called the dark night of the soul. And I think this is so powerful. Maybe especially if you're one of those people that came in today, struggling to see Jesus personally and practically through your circumstances. Because life with him hasn't turned out like you thought life with him would turn out. You're struggling with doubts, maybe ashamed of your doubts. And you assume that if Jesus wasn't done with you before, he's certainly disappointed with you now. If he could see what you're thinking, what you're feeling, what you're wondering, where you are from here. Can I encourage you? Look at Jesus' assessment of John in verse 28. Jesus says for the whole crowd to hear, I tell you, among those born of women, there is, present tense, no one greater than John. Jesus doesn't say, there used to be no one greater than John until the mighty have fallen with all of these doubts and the distraction that he's causing from me showing the whole crowd who I am. He says, keep looking at John. Keep following his lead. Keep looking where John is looking. Not only am I not ashamed of him, not only am I not disappointed in him, I want you to see what I see in him despite his struggle to see. And I want you to follow his lead as you pursue me through places where you can't see me in your circumstances or when I don't meet your expectations. I want you to do with your doubts exactly what John did with his, even when his circumstances didn't immediately get better. He's still trusting in the darkness what he had seen clearly in the light. My word is enough for him to trust my works, even when my works don't work out like he expected. That's why John's story is so encouraging, isn't it? That's why it's so encouraging to read a story of a guy like him whose story doesn't immediately go to a happily ever after, whose life and whose struggle and whose pain we'd all say wasn't wasted in the least. John's story is as bad as it can get for a follower of Jesus. The worst possible outcome for the best possible person. Merry Christmas, welcome to church, right? But that wasn't just the story that Jesus called John to live. That's the story Jesus stepped into history to live. And because of how Jesus lived, because of how Jesus died, we can see even more than John could see. Jesus came to take the absolute worst case scenario for a human: crucifixion by the Romans and abandonment by God, so that our worst case scenario, immediate death like John's, is immediate death and certain resurrection, is the worst case scenario for us. And Jesus kept proclaiming that over and over and over, what he'd come to do, what he'd come to bring. And the disciples, his followers, like us, could never get it. Just like John, just like the crowds, their circumstances, their expectations kept blinding them from who he is and what he's come to do. And then in Luke 18, Jesus invites the disciples and all of us to see the surprising story of an invisible blind man who sees. The least in the kingdom. An invisible man who shows all the blind people how to see. Look at verse 35, Luke chapter 18. As Jesus approached Jericho, he's on his way to Jerusalem. A blind man was sitting by the roadside begging. If you've been here for the whole series, don't miss this detail. A poor man begging for good news. When he heard the crowd going by, he asked what was happening. They told him, Jesus of Nazareth is passing by. So he called out, Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me. Those who led the way rebuked him and told him to be quiet. If you've been for the series, don't miss this. The captive, oppressed man who aches to break free. He shouted all the more, Son of David, have mercy on me. Jesus stopped and ordered the man to be brought to him. When he came near, Jesus asked him, what do you want me to do for you? And this is the moment for the man to say what's on his list. He knows Jesus is the one promised by the scriptures, the one that Isaiah 61 said would come. The Christmas gift unwrapped in person. He could have asked for anything. He says, Lord, I want to see. I don't know what you're walking through this Christmas. I imagine for some of us, perhaps many of us, we're experiencing joy and peace and hope, celebration. It's the most wonderful time of the year. And if that's you this Christmas, don't shy away from that. Don't be ashamed of that. Don't hide it. Don't filter it. Share it. We need to hear those stories. We'll see a couple of those stories in just a moment. Just like John, we need stories of where God has been faithful to his promise, even while we're waiting to see the light break through in our life. We need to hear your story if you're celebrating this year. Some of us, I imagine, are struggling this year to see. It's been a tough couple of years. The circumstances have overwhelmed a bunch of us. We've got doubts we've never had before, struggles that nobody else can see. And like John, we need more than just some Christmas carols and some bells. We need to know if Jesus is the one. We know he is theoretically, maybe even practically, philosophically. We need to know if Emmanuel really is. If Jesus is really with us personally. This Christmas, we're flying blind, and we need to see. I wonder if you'd take this same step as the invisible blind man. If that could be your simple request this Christmas. Lord, I want to see. I believe that's a request Jesus loves to answer. The kind of request that Jesus says the greatest man ever born of a woman asked. The request that he invites us to ask too. Lord, I want to see, not just a philosophy, not just a system or a strategy, not just a religion or a set of principles. I want to see the one who was promised, the one who's in control of everything, present and personal with me. And then keep on asking. Keep on seeking, keep on knocking, and see if this Christmas perhaps you don't get a surprise. Something perhaps that's different from what you think you need right now. Maybe even something that's different from what you knew to expect. Maybe not something at all, but the presence of someone who perhaps is better than all of the somethings all the way around. Would you bow your head with me? Lord, for the person who is begging you to see today, I pray that you would restore their sight. Perhaps for the person that showed up this morning wondering if you saw them, wondering if you cared for them, wondering why you're meeting the needs of everyone around them except them, that this example from John would show them that you see them and invite them to see you and to trust you to be present with them even while they wait to see the things that they're expecting and believe that they need. Lord, you promise that when we draw near to you, you draw near to us. So would you do that? Be faithful to that promise this Christmas. Would you guide us, even as we hope, sometimes from a distance, in the presence of other stories, and a God who takes the things that get planted in the dirt that we think are dead forever and makes those graves into gardens where we worship. We ask it in Jesus' name. Amen.
Hey, thanks for watching. If something you heard resonated with you today, we would love to connect with you. Visit doxology.church/connect or leave a comment below. And if you enjoyed today's message and you want to see more, make sure you give this video a like and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss any new videos.